Hello, and thank you for listening to Critical Thinking is Required. Today we're about to talk about For a New Liberty, which is part of our Critical Thinking is Required Literature Series 1. So this is our first series. So our second series will be starting next week, and it'll be a different book. It's going to be a much shorter book as well, so it should be a short series. And today we're going to discuss For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard, which was written in 1973. This is part 4, and we're going to be discussing Chapter 9. Now, Chapter 9 discusses the most important, I think, topic regarding libertarianism if you're trying to understand a principled argument of libertarianism, especially versus statism or whatever you want to call it. And this is about inflation and the business cycle. This is huge. So let's talk about boom and bust. So this is sort of the business cycle, I suppose. And so the economy is generally in two stages, right? It's either in a boom or it's in a bust. So it's either going through high times or it's just really bad times. And during the boom, during that stage, the prices are rising. And what happens when prices rise is you have this thing called inflation. Okay, so that's what inflation is. It's generally when prices rise. Now the bust, that's what happens, and we're going to talk about why that happens. But when that happens, and that's the negative part, there's either a recession or a depression. And during those times, you'll have unemployment. Now the Keynesian argument, so there's two economic arguments we're going to look at today. Very shortly, this is the Keynesian argument, and then we're going to look at the Austrian economics argument. And so the Keynesian view is that, well, in the boom, what has to happen, so in order to avoid this boom and bust business cycle, let's say, in the boom, the government has to increase taxes. Okay, and that sort of, it prepares itself for the boom, because things are moving up. You're going to be prepared for something happens. You'll have the increased taxes. Okay, you'll have more revenue to spend. And then you also need, technically what you need government spending, because you need to increase taxes, okay, in order to do all that stuff. And then in the bust, what happens is you have the government increase spending. So that's what I was about to talk about. So that's the opposite. So in the boom, when things are good, you increase taxes so that you can pay for everything and you can watch out for the bust. You can try to prevent it or try to watch out for it. In the bust, the government has to increase spending because you have a negative economy, right? So they have to intervene and they have to make everything better. They've got to stimulate the economy. That's what we see all the time when we watch the news. That's the economic plan today. But the problem is what do you do if there's inflation and high unemployment? So what do you do if there's this boom and bust, but it happens at the same time? So the consequences of both. So not that the boom and bust happen at the same time, but that the consequences of both happen at the same time, right? So, and we can see that today. So we have prices that are rising, and then we also have high unemployment. So what can be done? And the Keynesian, there's really no answer, I suppose, to that. So let's talk about inflation a little bit more. So inflation happens when, the prices are rising, right? So prices rise, that's inflation. So, today if I went to buy a cheeseburger at McDonald's, it was $1. Well, if next year it was $1.05, that's inflation. Assuming everything else remained constant, remained the same as far as production and stuff. And it's not required. So inflation, it's not like a natural part. Like it doesn't have to happen. What we have is we've sort of kind of created it through something called the Federal Reserve and through our economic policy through the government. And we're going to talk a whole deal about that. And one of the things why government stepped in is there's sort of a war against inflation. And I've termed this, Murray Rothbard didn't call it a war against inflation, but because the state loves to declare war against things, war on drugs, war on everything, war on, overseas, war on Russia, whatever, Cold War, there's a war against inflation. And what happened is the government has to step in because, and this is the argument on the progressive side, I suppose, is that because the greedy businessmen increase prices to increase profits. There's greed, that's what happens. So like let's say the burger, I go to McDonald's and it's $1, and next year it's $1.05. Well, what the progressive or the Keynesian is going to argue is that the reason it's $1.05 isn't because of the money supply, which is what Austrian would say, and because of government intervention. What it is it's greed. These business people want more money. So every year, they're just, because you're going to keep buying that cheeseburger, they're going to increase the prices of that cheeseburger. But then the question is, there's a lot of questions involved there. For instance, that there's got to be a limit, right? And the question then is, well, why not increase prices even more? So if these people are that greedy, why not just increase the cheeseburger to $1.25 next year? If I really want that cheeseburger, I'm going to pay $1.25, right? Now, there's got to be a reason they don't do that, right? So it's not necessarily just it's not necessarily greed, or it's not necessarily just greed, right? So let's talk briefly about price. There's a lot of economic terms that we're going to be talking about, and all of it's important to understand the main problem, really, of government intervention in the economy. So price, okay? So the price of something is the amount of money the buyer is willing to spend. So when you're going to buy something, it's the amount of money that the buyer is willing to spend. So if I buy that cheeseburger, I'm willing to buy it for $1, so the price is $1. I'm not willing to buy it for $1.50. So let's say the greedy businessman next year he upped the price to $1.50. Well, me personally, I'm not going to pay $1.50. So what's going to happen is if enough people failed to spend $1.50 on the cheeseburger, they would not sell as many cheeseburgers. So what they would either have to do is either stop selling the cheeseburger, or they'd have to decrease the price. And that's what they're going to do. They're going to decrease the price because they want to make money. They want revenue, and they want profit. And so they'll decrease it maybe to $1.40. And then if they'll see their numbers and see if it's moving a little bit. And if it's not, then maybe $1.20. Maybe they'll take a bigger hike or decrease until they figure out what people are willing to spend to get that item. Now, it's the interaction between the buyer and seller brings about the ruling price in the market. So that's just what I said. That's what's so beautiful about it. It's this like relationship that doesn't require any intervention by the state or anybody. It's us voluntarily interacting. It's the interaction between the consumer and then the person who's producing or selling the product. And that's what determines that price. And so it's sort of a supply and demand as well. So if the supply increased, then the price lowers. So if there are more cheeseburgers, they're producing way too many cheeseburgers. It's just easier to produce. Well, what they could do is they could keep it high, but then they're going to have to throw away all these extra cheeseburgers because nobody's really buying a lot of them, right? It's not like there's increased demand. So you have the increased supply, so they're going to lower the prices, and that'll make more people buy the cheeseburger. So now if the cheeseburger's 50 cents, or imagine when they have those sell days where they sell the cheeseburgers at McDonald's for like 49 cents, it's probably something to do with maybe the time where it kind of expires, or they have an increased supply that they're just trying to get rid of, and that's the way to do it. Of course you're going to have more people come in and buy your product. And if demand increases, so if the opposite happens, so if demand increases, so people want more cheeseburgers, well, then the price is going to rise. So supply has remained the same, right? So supply hasn't increased. If demand increases only. So you have 20 people coming into Burger King or McDonald's, and they want that $1 cheeseburger, but they only have 10 cheeseburgers. Well, theoretically, if it was its own business and not a franchise, McDonald's could up the price, and other things as well. The business could charge $1.50 or $2 for the cheeseburger. And that, if that's what the people are willing to pay voluntarily, that interaction, then you're going to have it. And there's going to have that set price. And that usually doesn't happen through barter anymore. I don't know if it would if there was no government. It's generally, like I said, it's like a price system that you would, you keep track of how many you sell. And then the way I look at it is when you pretend you're stocking your refrigerator. I mean, and this isn't anywhere near the same thing, but because there's no price mechanism. But when you stock your refrigerator and let's say you put Cokes and Diet Cokes, you kind of have to prepare for when you're going to need to buy new Diet. If you always want to have it stocked, you have to think, oh, I'm going to have a party this weekend, so I have to prepare for that, right? And that kind of acts as a price. That's what sets the price. Now, it's free in that example, so money can set the price. So this is something else. So you have the voluntary reaction, but the other problem is you have money. So yes, we can barter and we can come to an agreement of what will set the price, that interaction between the consumer and the seller. But the other thing that sets the price is money. And the money, that's whatever is the value of the exchange, whatever is the medium of exchange between the buyer and the seller, right? So I'm not going to trade him my computer or a video game or something for the cheeseburger or whatever is the value of $1. That's just what they've done is we set up money, and that would theoretically happen in a free market as well without government intervention, but that's a separate issue. But so what happens here is like let's say we have what we have today with the money, right? Well, if the amount of money in the buyer's possession increases by 20%, prices will rise 20%, right? Because there's a set amount of money. Let's just imagine this. There's a set amount of money out there, cash. Now, let's say the price of everything is $1 today, okay? Now, tomorrow, what happens is the Federal Reserve, we'll learn this later, let's say 20% of additional money is created. So of those little fancy dollar bills and stuff, you have 20% more that are created. Well, what's going to happen is prices are going to rise 20%, right? Because there's an increased supply of the money. If you didn't have that, then what would be the value? I mean, you just have to think of it common sense. Like, you're having an increase of 20% of the supply, so of course the prices are going to rise. And thus the stock or supply of money increases prices. It's not really greed. What is the stock or supply of money. That's what's going to happen. And so one of the things you can look at is I had two charts in here, and one of them is on the actual YouTube video, and there's two charts. One is the US dollar purchasing power, and this is during the 20th century, and I think it starts from 1900 and it goes to 2000. Assuming this is even sort of correct, okay, because this is from a random site, but I've just seen a lot of these things. It's the same down curve, okay, so let's just assume there's a down curve. What you see is that the purchasing power of the dollar, so the value of the dollar, what that dollar can buy, has decreased, exponentially. Like, we're talking from $25 in 1900 to like $1. So it's worth $2 today. So $1 bill has that value. Like, that's what I'm trying to say. So it's gone down a whole lot. Okay. And what that is it's because we've been increasing money, the money supply. So here I have a chart. It was the only chart I could really find that was from the Federal Reserve. I think it was a bank in New York or something, the Federal Reserve Bank. And you can see a chart, and this is only from 81 to 2008. So 1981, so the past 20 years or so, right? And you can see 20 or 30 years, and you can see the money supply has grown as well. So where the purchasing power of the dollar, you saw the down curve, but here you see an up curve because there's an increased money supply. So here I'm making a correlation, and we're assuming there's a correlation here, and not really just a correlation, but a causation here, where because the economic supply of money is going up, the price of the dollar, or the price of the money supply, is going down. That's because you're creating more of it. And that kind of goes back to that supply and demand thing, where if you increase supply, that price is going to lower, right? I mean, that's just a natural thing, right? And we already gave the example of that, and the same thing would apply to cash or money. There's no, that's the better way of saying it. I was kind of stumbling a little bit, but that's how you would explain the concept of that money can set price. So the question then is, how is money created? Because that's really important, right? Well, it arises on the market as individuals begin to choose commodities to act as money. So what happens is you have consumers, and they're going to choose things to act as money. And we gave the same example. I wouldn't go into Burger King or McDonald's and buy my $1 cheeseburger with a CD or something that had a value of $1, right? So you're going to have something that acts as money. Now, the best type of products would be something, or the best type of commodity would be something that's in high demand, durable, long storage, mobile, easily recognizable, readily divisible without losing value. So you really want it to be a strong type of material, something that can last a long time, something that can be moved across oceans, across seas, that can go in the air, that can fly everywhere, that can be seen and understood that is money. That's a commodity that should act as money. And that can be kind of degraded in a sense of physically degraded without losing any value, or without losing extreme amount of value. And so historically, what has happened, for thousands of years, is that gold and silver are the commodities that are chosen to act as money. And gold, it has long storage, it's mobile, it's easily recognizable, it meets all those things, and it's sort of limited too. That, to me, that's the really important part of a commodity as acting as money, is that it's limited. That was something that I think he kind of missed, but I'm sure he talked about it. Maybe I just missed it, but that kind of is the same thing with Bitcoin, where Bitcoin's limited. It's not infinite. So I don't know. I just think that's important. In contrast to the dollar that we have today, it's infinite. And we will talk about that a little bit more as well. So now we have something called the gold standard. So we have that commodity, right? And it's usually gold or silver. And so what happens is there's something called the gold standard. And that's when a society or state adopts a certain commodity as money, and it uses that daily, and then it adopts that commodity as a standard. Okay, so you would adopt gold, let's say, because it meets all those guidelines, and then the society generally would adopt it as a commodity standard. And the natural course, of course, is gold or silver. So you're going to have a gold or silver standard. Generally, it's a gold standard, right? That's what we hear about. And And the difference between Bitcoin is that you don't have the whole of society or general society that has accepted Bitcoin. It's a very small minority of people. Now, until it got to a bigger standard, then it could act as a commodity. But even then, it doesn't necessarily meet all those characteristics of a commodity that should act as money. So there can be a difference there, right? Now, the supply of gold is determined by the market, so it's not infinite. So we were going with that again. That's the good thing here. That's the thing that protects the value of money. Because again, if supply went up, prices are going to go up, right? And the value of that gold is going to go down, right? That's what that means. When prices go up, the value of the dollar goes down. And that's why I had those charts. And that's why this is one of the most important issues you can school yourself about and learn about, educate yourself about, not school, educate yourself about, because this affects everybody, and it definitely affects poor people the worst, but it really does affect everyone, and it's just a horrible, horrible consequence of government intervention. So the supply of gold is determined by the market, and what happens is technological conditions of supply and then the price of other commodities. So those are the things that determine the standard of gold, right? Because you're going to have increased technology, maybe that can mine more gold. Other commodities like silver and other type of competition commodities like competitive, like Bitcoin or something like, or anything that would act as a commodity, that could also kind of determine the supply of gold because there's competition. So then you would have increased supply because businesses would go, oh, we need to have more of this stuff. So why would the state want control over the money supply? So that's the big question. You always got to look at the intent. So why would the state want this? And the biggest thing, and this is what Murray Rothbard, right, and I would definitely agree with, is it's the alternative to taxation. So you can tax, and we can have taxes, and we can have income tax and sales tax and all this stuff, but all that stuff we see, right? So the government's always trying to find ways to tax us and to take money from us or steal it or however you want to word it. They're trying to do that really without our knowledge. So one of the things they've been doing recently is the fees, right? So when you go to a hotel, let's say, you have to pay a hotel fee, a tax sort of, that you might not really see. You might just see your bill and you don't look at the tax of $10 or something. That adds a lot to the price, but you don't really think about it. But sometimes you do. It depends on if you actually look at it. The other thing would be like on your cell phone bill. They do the same kind of stuff. This is what they're trying to do. They're going to continue to, you'll probably see on the internet if they don't do it already. So it's an alternative. If they can find a way to tax you without your knowledge, that's the ultimate goal. That's awesome. And that's what this does. When they control money supply, it's an alternative to taxation. So what it did is it acquired the monopoly power to counterfeit, which is the Federal Reserve and the production of money. That's what they're doing. They're counterfeiting money because they're degrading it. They're devaluing it. They're creating money that has no value. It's not attached to anything. And so the result is you have a fiat paper standard. And so that's what we have today. We don't have gold standard. We have a fiat paper standard. So we have the bill. We have that paper. That's all it is. You can't take it into the bank and get $10 in gold if it's a $10 bill. It's just a piece of paper. And you would hope that the bank and whoever, the Federal Reserve or whatever, is going to give you that $10. So really the bank. And the dollar is basically just a piece of paper with names stamped on, by the state, whatever picture they want to show. And so the result that you're going to have is inflation. And why? It's because the bottom line is, it's paper. It's not backed by anything. It's what I was saying earlier before. If you can increase the supply by just printing them out, then that's probably what you're going to do. With gold, you're limited. It's harder to do that. And so, the question really is, and Murray points this out, is like, let's say, here's the example. Let's say the government gave one family. So you are the family. You are the lucky chosen one, okay? You're the golden child, the Eddie Murphy of the 80s, okay? And the government gives you the absolute and unlimited power to print all the dollars you want. $100 bills. You can just print all the ones you want. What are you going to do with that power? Are you just going to create $200, $500, $1,000, or millions? You're going to produce millions. Like, who would not do that? If you don't do that, you need to not only think critically, that's definitely required, but you need spirituality. You need to go to church, okay? Even if you don't believe in God, you need to be honest with yourself. You need a call. You need to do something and answer. But why is it any different with government? If government's given that responsibility, I mean, one would think it's even worse, right? Because now you have all these people who are competing to get, I mean, because you're going to have friends come to your house and be like, yo, man, I heard you had this power, man. Can I just have $20? No, $200. No, $2,000. Like, you're going to have that. Well, with government, you have the same thing, but it's taken to a whole nother level, right? So I think that was a really good example of the problem with inflation and the problem with controlling the money supply. And so you have political problems with inflation, and this is why they wanted to have control. Well, it's too visible. You don't want to have the public figuring out that here's this problem when you control the money and commodities, all that, and they're going to take the power away. So what they did is the government created something called the Federal Reserve and the fractional reserve banking system. And this goes back to Murray Rothbard stuff that he was just talking about in the earlier chapters, where I forget what the technical term was. It was like jargon, right? Political jargon. It's this idea of making these complicated words to make things complicated so that we can't understand them, that we have to look to experts, people who are the ruling class, right? The intellectuals who have the power, who are better than us. We can trust them to make the right decisions for all of us. And it shouldn't be any different. You can apply the same example with giving someone the ultimate authority to control money to the same thing with a bureaucrat in any office, whether it's local or national or state, whatever. It doesn't matter. If someone has the power to deny or approve something, they're going to do bad and good with that power. There's no question. None. Nobody is pure enough. Nobody is non-man. So we have this problem, right? And so what's the Federal Reserve? This is a big thing, right? The Federal Reserve is basically the central bank for the United States. So we've had central banks since the dawn of this country, like immediately. I think it was 1791. I think if you listen to the interview with James Corbett about the Federal Reserve, I mean, this thing was created initially. So for anyone who thinks that we had a free market the past 200 and 300 years, that is false. And the central bank has basically it's been here. It's had more power now, of course, just like everything else. But today we'll call it the Federal Reserve. And it basically controls the entire commercial banking system. It's got control over all the banks, pretty much. And what it does is it permits commercial banks to pyramid deposits on top of the Fed's own reserves. And we're going to talk a lot about this stuff. But this is fractional reserve banking, okay? That's what we're talking about at this moment, fractional reserve banking. And so basically what that is it's what the Federal, I'm trying to make this as easy as possible. The Federal Reserve basically says to these banks, this is the money that you need to have, okay? So there's in 1973 when Murray Rothbard wrote this book, For a New Liberty, it was a 6-to-1 ratio. So basically what that means is that if the bank reserves at the Federal Reserve, so if the reserves that the Federal Reserve owns, and we're going to talk about this, so it might be a little complicated here, but let's say the Federal Reserve increases their reserves by $1 billion. Well, what the banks can do is, because of that 6-to-1 ratio, is they can pyramid those deposits by $6 billion. So they can basically create $5 billion extra, is my understanding of how the math works. Maybe it's not necessarily correct, but let's just understand it's 6-to-1, okay? So you have, because they still have to have the $1 billion, okay? It's 6-to-1. And so the Federal Reserve creates this $1 billion, and it permits them. It says this is your limit. This is you can't go any higher, right? You couldn't have 20-to-1. It's 6-to-1, and so you can now create additional money. And because of what we talked about, when you increase supply, you're going to increase prices, right? So let's also. Yeah, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. So it's the stock of the money. Okay, so the stock of the money. If the stock of the money is increased, and the supply, then the prices of goods are going to increase. So it's not necessarily that the supply and demand thing, supply prices are actually going to lower, but of goods, right? But of cash, it acts because it's a stock of money, okay? So I just want to correct myself there. I had to pause it and I had to look it up. I just want to make sure everything's correct here. But now today, so there was a 6-to-1 ratio in 1973, but today there's a different ratio. And of course, the Federal Reserve made this to help bigger banks because that's what they do. And so if you're a bank and it's less than 12.4 million, there's no ratio. Okay, there's none. If you're making 12.4 to 79.5 million dollars, it's a 1/3 to 1 ratio, which is about 3%. And if it's over $79.5 million is your revenue or whatever the thing is, I think it's revenue, that you have a 10-to-1 ratio. Okay, so they can actually create more. Okay, they can create 10 to 1. So for every $1 billion that the Federal Reserve creates and owns, and we're going to talk about this, then for every 1 million or 1 billion or whatever you want to say, 1 billion, then the banks can create $10 billion. So they can loan out 9 billion and then they can sit on the 1 billion. Okay, that's what the Federal Reserve allows the commercial banks to do. They permit it. They say this is what you can do. And so bank deposits are money. So that's the question. What is this bank deposits? How does that work? Basically bank deposits constitutes as a promise by a bank that it will redeem its demand deposits in cash. That's the Federal Reserve notes anytime the deposit holder, the customer, desires. Okay, so basically, here we go, is that you have a deposit holder, you have the customer who's going to go to the bank, right? They're going to basically get something from the bank, and that's this bank deposit. They're going to deposit their money, right? And they're going to get a note, this Federal Reserve note, that's going to say that you can get your money back in the future. Right? So that's basically what it says. But like we said, with the ratio and all that stuff, is that they don't have to actually have the money. So again, they can loan out. I mean, they don't have to have the money. So they can loan out the 9 billion, even though they only have 1 billion. So if everyone who has loaned out the 9 billion, let's say they continue to they did business with the bank and all that stuff, and then they came back and because they now have $9 billion. Then if they came back and said, well, I guess that's not right because it's actually a loan, so I don't know. But the bottom line is that the banks don't have the money. Okay, they don't have the money, and that's because of that ratio. Because the money, they only have to have that reserve. So I'm getting right here. This is complicated for me. I'm not an economist. I'm trying to teach myself this stuff. They have the $1 billion, but they have 10 billion that's out. Okay, and that money is going to other. I guess that's where I'm getting it at. I'm thinking here. So because basically, they can call back the loan, but at the same time, if those people who took the loan already spent the money, well, then the bank then itself gave that money to another bank, or basically did the transfer of that paper, that electronic, right? You get what I'm saying? Like, so basically, there's no money there. And there's really, the money's gone, and at that point they could call in the loan, but the guys don't have to necessarily pay back. But then the bank has no money, even though it gave out $9 billion. And then not only that, but then you have the Federal Reserve that's going to bail you out. So if something does happen, you have FDIC as well, where there's a point limit where they're going to provide money as well. So the question then, and I'm getting here. Maybe I should have just went to the next slide. So how do banks create new deposits? Well, the banks receive the $1 billion in new reserves from the Federal Reserve, right? Then they lend out the $6 billion. So this is to the 6-to-1 ratio by creating new deposits. So those loans is what we were talking about. But it's not the existing money that's deposited, it's the additional money. So they have the $1 billion reserves, they lend out the 6, they've in itself created $5 billion. And that, thinking outside the box here, not just reading what he writes, because I don't know if he really explains this, but it goes back to what I was saying where, it's a loan, but that money is spent, so it goes somewhere else, right? It's out of the hands of the bank at that time because they have to do whatever thing they do to transfer whatever that note or whatever to the other bank. And so basically it's just money being created, which is just crazy. And then there's this thing called open market purchases. And this is probably the worst part of it. This is the part where the Federal Reserve comes in and intervenes. I mean, they do it in this whole thing, of course, with fractional reserve banking, but now we have something with the reserves, okay? And this is how the Fed determines the total reserves of the banks. Okay, so this is the total reserves of the banks. What determines that $1 billion? Remember the 6-to-1 ratio? Why am I picking $1 billion? Where's that money come from? Well, what happens is the Federal Reserve goes to the open market and they buy an asset. They just do this. At least this is what Murray Rothbard writes. So I'm assuming this is true, right? I'm assuming everything he's writing is true. Maybe one day we'll counteract some of this stuff. And so they go to the open market, buy an asset. And what they generally do, it could be anything, but what they generally do is buy U.S. government bonds. And so what's going to happen is the seller, they're going to receive the note, okay? And then the seller takes the note to the bank. And what you have is that the bank The Federal Reserve isn't open to private individuals. It's only banks and the federal government. So there you have your corporate welfare again, where you have the relationship between the government and big banks and big corporations, because they're not open to private. I can't receive the note and then take it to the Federal Reserve. Only they can. Man, this is a hard episode. So I had to pause it again to fully understand this. Again, I'm going to say this at the intro. You need to make sure, if you don't understand what I'm saying, just check out the PowerPoint presentation, reread it, reread it. You will understand this stuff. You'll be able to explain it. And I'm able to explain it, but I've got to read this stuff a little bit, just to remind myself here. And so what happens, okay, the Fed goes to the open market, they buy an asset, okay? They're going to buy the U.S. government bonds. Now, the seller of the asset, see, I have to make it clear there. The seller of the asset, so whoever they bought the thing from, they're going to buy this government bonds. It's going to be somebody, and they're going to receive this note, okay? This deposit, this note, basically paper or whatever. Then, but it's all electronic nowadays. And then that seller is going to take that note to the bank, okay? But again, these are corporations that are working. These aren't private individuals. These are corporations that are these are banks, okay? Just banks. So the seller is going to be the bank. And they're going to take it to a bank. And then what they're going to get is that sellers, whoever sold the asset, the government bond, is going to get the note price in their own checking account. Okay, so the Federal Reserve buys the asset from the seller. Let's say they pay $1 billion, okay, for this government bonds, which is just paper, right? The seller is going to receive that note that says, this is worth $1 billion. You're going to take it to the bank. You're going to say, bank, I want $1 billion in my checking account. They're going to do that. Then the bank is going to go to the Federal Reserve, and they're going to say, I want $1 billion, right? And so what's going to happen is the seller's money supply goes up, but really nobody else's goes up. Okay, so the seller they now have $1 billion. They now have $1 billion that they can spend. Now the feds basically create this money out of thin air. So the Federal Reserve just bought the asset. It's a government bond. It's all paper. There's no commodity, no anything backing any of this stuff up. And what's going to happen is the bank gets the increase of $20, assuming the seller doesn't spend it. So here in our example is that the bank is going to get the increase of $1 billion because it's in the checking account of the seller, right? So the seller hasn't necessarily spent it. It would be a different story if they always spent it. But they take it to the bank, and now the bank has $1 billion. So in our example that we're talking about with $1 billion, the bank now has $1 billion. And if so, because of the 10-to-1 ratio, which we have now, they could then create $9 billion to loan to other people. And that's what creates inflation, right? Because the stock of supply of money, this is the principle of all this stuff, is that the stock of supply of money is going to go up, and that's going to rise prices. Okay? So I'm going to try to do it one more time so we can try to understand this, okay? So the Federal Reserve, they determine the total reserves at the banks. Okay, they go to the open market. These are the open market purchases, probably the worst thing they can do. They buy an asset, which is a government bond, this individual or whatever this thing is, whoever's buying it, right? That buyer, that seller of the asset, the bonds, is going to receive a note. They're going to take that note to the bank, okay? The seller is going to get that note. So whatever that note was worth is going to go into the checking account of that person, of the seller, and then the bank is going to go to the Fed and get that money. Then, because of the ratio that's set up by the Federal Reserve, the bank can then loan out $9 billion, or the 10-to-1 ratio, right? That, of course, is going to create inflation. That's a huge problem, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit more about it. So again, bottom line is this is government intervention. This isn't free market. There's nowhere in here at all that I can find anything where you can make an argument that this is the free market working by itself without any government intervention causing this problem of inflation, which is increased prices, which is a tax. So Federal Reserve System, just a little bit more. What was created in 1913. In 1933, the U.S. went off the gold standard. So it was basically removed the shackles. So the shackles of the gold standard, and that's what I was saying before, is the gold standard acts as a way to limit supply of the standard of money. If you don't have that, which they didn't when they went off the gold standard, the value of that money, of that note or whatever whatever the money is at that time, which was the Federal Reserve note, it's going to go, the value of it's going to go down, right? Because the supply goes up. prices are going to go up. You're going to need more dollars to buy things. And prior to that, the note was actually redeemable in gold, right? So you could actually go to there are actually, if you can find some, there are actually some dollars and stuff you'll find that'll say, I have some, you'll see the blue. If you can catch, I think the red ones too, but there's like a dollar bill and it'll have a blue symbol instead of the green weird symbol. I don't know how to explain what the symbol is, but it'll say silver dollar certificate. So I'm talking of the silver, of course, silver standard. But you could actually take that to a bank. I have a couple of these. You could actually take it to a bank and get silver of that dollar, right? You can get $1 worth of silver. Now that is nowhere near the truth now. Now, and it goes back to what we were talking before, is that the Federal Reserve can't create gold. That's too difficult. But this money, just the notes we were talking about earlier, the federal fractional reserve banking, all this stuff, they can just create it out of thin air. And why not? I mean, that's how you can answer all life's problems, is just spending money, right? War on poverty, spend money. War on terrorism, spend money. Easy. War on drugs, spend money on police militarization, on courts, all this stuff, on prisons. Well, in 1971, so in 1933 they went off the gold standard, but they were still open actually to foreign governments, so it still applied. So if foreign governments still owned gold, they could actually go to a bank in the United States and get gold for it. Well, in 1971 they had enough. The U.S. went off the gold window, so it's completely shut off at this point in our, currently. And we can look at what happened afterwards. So Murray Rothbard, in our last section, in our last part of the literature series, I think part 6, we're going to discuss that 1970s were horrible. Like the inflation was just jumped off the roof in 73 to 75. And you can even look at a chart that we had in the beginning where you can see that, I'm going to try to go right now, where you can even see that in the 70s there was like a bump, okay? And so, that you have all these problems, okay? And you can see all the problems. And what really interested me about what's opened my eyes a little bit, and I think you should think about this a little bit, is that one of the correlations I always made was the war on poverty. And I always thought that was one of the worst things that happened, right? You can make this correlation chart between government intervention and all the problems we have. So like, let's say everything is going down. Let's say wages are going down, unemployment's going up, every problem that you can think of. And let's say it started in the 60s and 70s, because that's when it did. Well, short term at least. I mean, because these problems have been going on for a long time. And we can see in that downward curve, the money supply, 1900, it's always been going down. And I'm sure if there was an 1800 chart, it would be going down as well, right? But I was always thinking about that. And then you hear from progressives and they look at Citizens United, and you can make the correlation there. The Citizens United was about that time, maybe a little bit afterwards. And so of course, all these corporations are spending more money into politics. You have greed and corruption in politics. And so of course you're going to have that relationship. But the problem, this is another one you can add to the correlation. You can say, yeah, maybe those two are, but the gold standard. So now we have no gold. Like there's no shackles to the money supply. And so what that means is the Federal Reserve can basically create money at a whim, out of thin air. And so now we're going to talk about the consequences of creating money out of thin air. And so you have this thing called the business cycle, right? So we were talking about that in the beginning. It's a regularly recurring series of booms and busts. This isn't necessarily required. We were talking about this before. For example, if there was a boom in computers, let's say for iPads, let's say, and the sale of iPads it was really popular product. People just kept buying it and buying it and buying it. And then they just realized it was dumb, and people, like, you can even see it now where they stopped kind of buying it, or even like Facebook or something with the stock. People are buying it, or technology stocks, these things. And then you have a bust. Well, it only really affects the people who own, it really only affects only the people who own the stock. So in that example, but let's say with the iPads, is that it's only going to affect the Apple, right? And of course, it's going to have some after effects with people who, live in those communities, maybe wherever Apple is set up its headquarters and it has all its production and all its headquarters and stuff. Yeah, maybe it would be worse there, but it's not going to affect the overall economy, right? And so it's just it's going to fix itself. It's going to be problematic, but we're going to get okay with it. It's not a huge bust. It's not a big boom. It's not always happening, and it's not in the total economy, which is what happens today, right? We have a housing crisis, and it's a big boom, it's a big bust, and it affects everybody for some reason. Even though that doesn't really affect everybody either. But the housing crisis is a whole lot different, and we'll talk about it as well, although I'll probably do a future episode about it as well. But it's a whole lot different than, let's say, iPads, okay? And so why does this occur? Well, you have two reasons, I suppose, and progressives are also going to look at industry's fault, right? It's the greed of these business people. They want to make this money, like we talked about in the beginning with Keynesian. They want to make the money, and so that's why this happens. And then the other thing is the banking system's fault. And that's, libertarians are generally going to agree that it's the Federal Reserve, it's this government intervention in the money supply and the fractional reserve banking, all this stuff. These are problems, inflation, etc. So let's talk specifically about the banking system's fault. So why is it the banking system's fault? So again, we have the fractional reserve banking. We were talking about that. Remember the ratio, 6-1 in 73. Today it's 10-1. And what that does is you have a bank credit expansion. So we talked about this again. They can loan money. They can expand credit. Okay, but there's really no money there. Remember, there's no reserves. There's just the 1 billion out of the 10 billion. And what's that going to do? Remember, we're thinking here. Thinking critically, the money supply went up, so prices of goods are going to go up. And what it also does, and this is one of the things that I never even thought about, and I'm glad I hope you're listening or you're looking at the PowerPoint presentation. This is really, really informative stuff that is, I think, crucial to the libertarian philosophy. And what this stuff does, this whole fractional reserve, this whole mess of government intervention in the economy, and in banking in general, is that it artificially lowers the rate of interest. Okay, this is really important, especially in understanding housing crisis and all these other problems, these booms and busts. Okay, it artificially lowers the rate of interest because the government is setting the rate of interest. It's not naturally occurring. So it's this arbitrary rate that, you know how you hear the Federal Reserve they're keeping interest QE3, right? They're keeping it at 2%. Or 1%, okay? Well, they want to have lower rates of interest because what that does is it sparks increased spending, okay? But what that does is when they artificially do it, they're doing it arbitrarily. It's not based on any type of demand and supply and demand. It's them creating it, okay? And what that does is it sends misleading signals to businessmen, which causes them to make unsound investments. They're going to say, oh, I can't put the money into savings. You know, I can't correct. We're going to talk about this, so I don't want to mess myself up like I did earlier. But basically what they're going to do is they're going to make unsound investments, and that's what we call malinvestment. Okay, so the more loans by banks, you're going to have lower interest rates. So what's the natural rate of interest? Mr. Smart Guy, like what, Murray Rothbard too. It's not me here. What's this natural rate of interest? You're telling me there's a natural rate? Like, that's crazy. You tell me the private market doesn't pick this number out of their butt? Well, it's determined by the time preferences of all the buyers and sellers in the economy. So again, what you have in the economy is it's anarchy, right? Anarchy is beautiful, right? Jeffrey Tucker thing. You have all these people who are doing these interactions one another voluntarily without any intervention, although they don't really need the intervention, let's say. But we're doing these things. We're going to a store, I'm buying something, I'm selling something, and so that determines what the natural rate of interest is. So we can talk about the loan. So what a loan does is basically it gives you a present good, okay? It's money that can be used now, and it's exchanged for a future good. Okay, so this is back to the loans, right? So the bank is giving the 10-1 ratio. They're giving out the $9 billion. That's a loan. Now the money that person is receiving, the consumer, whoever's getting out the loan, well, now they have $9 billion that they can spend on their own. They can use it now, and it can be exchanged for a future good, a payment later, of course. But the people, this is the natural state of man. So we're getting back to the fundamental cores of human beings, just in generally, unless you think we're this unnatural type of person, there's amazing people, is that we want to spend money now, right? Most people want to spend money now, and it makes sense. It's a self-interest thing. It's a surviving thing. Is that it's not worth the risk to wait. So whenever you make a loan and whenever you're thinking about saving or something, you always risk things. Like if you were dying tomorrow, if you knew you were going to die tomorrow, you are probably going to spend more money, unless maybe you had a family and you were going to give it to somebody. But otherwise, if you're not going to take that risk. Why am I going to? Maybe I could survive, but I'm not going to take that risk. And so you could apply that to many different examples. So there's a present goods contain a premium over future goods, right? So if I can get the item now, it's going to have a premium over future goods. It's going to be have more value, I suppose. And that's what sets the interest rate. The premium is the interest rate. Okay? So the more loans that happen now, so remember the 9-to-1 ratio or the 10-to-1 ratio, if $9 billion is being given out, right? Then what's going to happen is you're going to have a lower rate of interest. Okay? I'm hoping everybody can understand it, because basically because you can get more money. So when you have the lower rate of interest, what you're going to have is you're going to have that more spending, right? More loans, lower rate of interest, more spending, and that's that malinvestment. And so what is the result of having a decrease of interest rate? So if the interest rate, whether natural or whether through intervention, is going to be lower, okay, let's say it's lower because there's going to be that premium, right? We want that present good over the future good. So we're going to want money now. And when the interest rate's set and it's low, so the Federal Reserve sets the interest rate, when it's low, businesses are going to invest in capital goods. And your results are some positive, right? You're going to have more capital goods. They're going to invest in that. And they're also going to invest in higher wages because they're going to have to spend this money. And because they're buying capital goods, they're going to use that to make things, right? So capital goods are like things like durable equipment, industrial raw material, construction, building houses. I mean, that would be capital goods. And then they're going to pay higher wages, right? So this is what the government's going to say. This is why we need to have a lower interest rate, so that we can spur economic growth, right? So we're going to increase supply, right? Or we're going to increase demand, really, is what they're doing, and to hope to increase. Well, I don't know what's the saying. I'm trying to think of I'm making it too complicated here. Bottom line, because this is easy. Low interest rate. You're going to have businesses that are going to invest in capital goods and higher wages. It makes sense. I mean, you can just think about it. Like, what are you going to buy? I'm going to buy a thing. Am I going to buy I don't know, am I going to buy food and things like that? Am I going to get my hair cut if I'm a business? Am I just going to do simple things like that, whatever the equivalent is to that? Or am I going to try to increase my profitability? And I'm going to do that by buying capital goods, by expanding, right? Building. That makes sense, right? And so what you're going to have is, and I guess I could have just went on to the next part, which is why you need to read the slides, which is result is increased demand. So I was right. Okay. I'm not an economist here, but all I got to do is just listen to this a few times, I guess, and read this slide, and I'll understand this stuff real cool and cold right here. So the result is increased demand. Now, they're creating this. This is government creating this by having a decreased interest rate, an unnatural, really, interest rate, because the government's setting it by whatever number they think it should be at that time, rather than based on the premium of the risk of time. And so the result is the increased demand, and what you're going to have is the labor costs are going to increase because more people want the stuff. Okay, so the businessmen, they're creating houses. I mean, this explains the housing crisis, right? So the businessmen, they're going to invest in houses. They're going to build these houses, even though there wasn't really any demand, right? But now there's demand because there's an increase of supply. That's where I was going with. The increased supply, now you're going to have increased demand here in this instance. And so labor costs are going to increase. Things are going to get more expensive for the businessmen because they have to kind of keep up, okay? You have the houses, you're going to have to fill it with somebody, right? And the higher wages are good because that's probably making some people a little bit more money, so maybe they can buy more houses and things like that, right? So you have that. And then businesses think they can meet these costs. So they go, okay, labor costs is going to increase a little bit, fine. We'll just take it out, and we're going to keep paying this stuff. We're going to keep investing, keep doing what we can do, right? And so workers are going to spend the higher wages, just like I said, but they're not going to spend it on capital goods. So again, and this is really the crux of the problem, I think, is that they're like, to the progressive, let's say, if the progressive wanted to do something and try to fix it, let's say, if they could, is that the consumer, these workers who are making all this money, because these are really the only people who could be making money. These are the only people it could be affecting. So really it's just the workers and then the people who supply the products, the actual capital goods, right? That's the only people who really have a true direct positive effect of the low interest rate, besides the banks, right? And the business people, right? So, the corporate welfare there. And so they're going to spend their higher wages, but they're not going to spend on the capital goods. So they're not going to expand their own business. They're not going to keep this going. It's not the pyramid scheme, because this really is sort of like a pyramid scheme. It's not going to continue. it's going to stop because what they're going to spend it on is consumer goods. So they're going to start going to restaurants. They're going to start, I don't know, getting services, maybe massages. I don't know what kind of consumer. Maybe go to the movies, things like that. Buy clothes. They're not going to spend it on things that could make them money, and they're not going to save it either. Which theoretically, if they gave it to a bank, the bank could expand because they have the 10-to-1 ratio, right? They could then expand and loan out. If you gave $10, they could then loan out $90, right? Which is crazy, by the way, because that's your money. And so there's a problem there. Can we see it? So they're spending the money, but it's on consumer goods. It's not investment. It's not really creating anything. And what you're going to have as a result is depression in capital goods. So now the capital goods that the businesses men were spending on it at first, well, nobody's spending on it anymore. So yeah, the businessman is, but the workers aren't. The workers have to do it too. And what that says is that the businessmen shouldn't have invested so much initially in the capital goods, because there's this balance. There's like this weird natural balance between consumption, which is consumer goods, and investment, capital goods. Okay, and so you're going to have that depression in capital goods, and unfortunately, whether it's like a recession or just a depression or whatever it's going to be, but you're going to have to reestablish that healthy and natural proportion between consumer goods spending and capital goods spending, the businesses and then the workers. Right? So I hope you can kind of understand how that really works. So again, capital goods spending, if we continue to spend capital goods because it's building things, it's producing something, then the cycle could theoretically continue. Right? But unfortunately, that's not how it works. Okay, so if you can, let's say the consumer the worker who spent the wages could somehow build a house, and that's going to create jobs, right? Because they're going to have to hire people with higher wages and all, but they're not going to have money for that, right? And they're not going to have as near the capital as the businessmen will to invest in those capital goods, right? So that's a problem as well, because they have and I didn't even think about that. I mean, that's another problem of Keynesian economics, is that they can't spend it on capital goods. So here, I've answered my own question here. You really couldn't even continue the cycle. I don't know why he didn't write this, because that's kind of key. Is that you can't spend it on capital goods. It's impossible, unless because you're not a businessman. If you're making $60,000 compared to a business that makes $100 million, well, what the hell are you going to be able to invest in? Nothing that could continue this weird cycle. And so this is the result of the interest rate, of the decrease of the interest rate, right? So naturally what would happen is that you wouldn't have this, and I suppose we will be talking about this. So I don't want to mess myself up and talk about that. So I came up with a few charts to just talk about inflation. And so there's some groups that say, what inflation? Like inflation isn't so bad. It hasn't really been happening. And it's interesting because there's some charts that show items, and this is the bias of the media too, I guess you can always see, is that I can always pick items where the value of something has gone down, where the price of it has gone down, right? And so, of course, if money supply has really been going up, then the prices should be going up, right? Because of inflation, prices rise, right? But that's not happening in all products. The question is, well, why is that not happening? And so in some examples, you'd have to explain each example, right? That's really high. It's probably increased production, some technological advances, increased competition, less regulation. I don't know what it would be. But the bottom line is that, yeah, you can find those things, but guess what? I can find things where the prices have increased. So yeah, maybe a CD costs $2 less than it did 30 years ago, but damn, like a loaf of bread from just 20 years ago costs 100% more. A movie ticket costs 100% more. The average house, 1980 cost $76,000. In 2005, probably today $275,000. That's inflation. That's nothing else. To be truthful, what should be happening is everything should be going down. We should have deflation, right? The decrease of prices because of everything I just said, the technological advances, the increased competition, the lower regulation. You're going to have all that stuff. People are going to create new things that should make things cheaper. And unfortunately so yeah. And then you can look at food inflation too. So you can look at certain things and you can see, yeah, it's going up here, going down here. But the bottom line is that the increased supply, and you can look around you and look at your wallet as well. And then I was looking at the milk too. Milk prices went up dramatically as well. So what's the solution? What would Murray Rothbard say is the solution? Well, government should not be involved, right? They should just not be involved. They should not intervene here. The fractional reserve banking, that system should not be occurring, because the Federal Reserve should not be buying assets through the open market and doing all that stuff. No. And I guess we'll talk about that in the next slide. They should stop inflating money supply, stop intervening. If I could define the book of Murray Rothbard in 2 words, is stop intervening. That's what should happen. That is the solution to all these problems. Stop state intervention. Here are the 3 words. So what are the themes of this long literature series? And I apologize. I hope I was able to. I think if you're thinking about it and you paused after some of the sections, I think you can understand it. I'm hoping. I'll be listening to this afterwards and we'll see. But the themes, okay? The Federal Reserve's intervention, and that's a state, so that's a government. The Federal Reserve's intervention in the economy through open market purchases, purchases, and the fractional reserve banking, so both of those things. I have a typo here. So the Federal Reserve intervention in the economy through open market purchases. So open market purchases is a big problem. And fractional reserve banking. Those are 2 big problems that are both caused and created by the Federal Reserve through intervention. And those result in whatever the positive effects, if there are, there's 2 huge negative effects. And that's inflation, and it artificially lowers interest rates. Okay, so inflation, that's horrible. That is probably one of the worst things that you can talk about as well, right? That's the inflation of the stock, the money supply, because they're buying this stuff through the open market purchases. They're buying that. They're doing all this really tricky stuff to basically create money out of thin air. And what that does is when the stock of supply of money goes up, prices go up. And remember, the wages of people aren't going up either. So theoretically, the progressive could argue, well, okay, let's say we do have this. Well, let's have increased wages. Let's have a minimum wage. But the problem is what about the millions of people who don't work or who don't want to work? It's like you're forcing them to work. There's slavery, right? Because how am I going to go out and buy a cheeseburger when maybe 5 years ago it could have just been $0.25, but now it's freaking $5? Like, that's not right. That's not right to the poor person, especially. And then you're gonna say, well, they should be eating healthier. Well, they're freaking poor. The goal should be wanting them to eat in the first place, right? And through the lack of government intervention, you wouldn't have that. You wouldn't have the prices rise. You'd have the natural rising, right? You'd have the natural rate of inflation, which would be based on individuals, based on that risk and reward type of thing of the premium of looking at the future or looking at it now. Do I need the money now or can I wait later? And that's what sets the rate of inflation. And so then the other and that's the problem, artificially low interest rates. When the Federal Reserve comes in, they set these rates. They say it's 2%. They're going to cut it a quarter of a point. Right? We hear all that stuff on CNBC. That's what they're doing. That's going to spur that whole list of problems that I just talked about, where they're going to come in. Businessman's going to invest in capital goods. They're going to, increase wages and all that stuff. You're going to have, people increase demand, so people are going to be actually buying this stuff, which is, oh, this is awesome, this is great. The businessmen, because of that increased demand, they're going to be like, oh, okay, I can just keep working, I'll keep doing it. But the problem is that the wages, the only people's wages who really went up significantly, or at least a little bit more than just like 10 cents, are the higher wages people. And unfortunately, they're not buying capital goods because they don't have the money to, so it's impossible to do it, really. Nor would they probably want to. They're buying it on consumer goods, and so it's stopping that cycle, and so that results in a depression, which results in the whole problem. Okay, and so that's today's episode, today's literature series. I hope you understood it. I hope I do when I listen to this. And I say thank you for listening. I think this is the most important show that I have made in understanding this stuff, and I think I made it easy enough. I think I made it easy enough to understand, and I hope you enjoy it. Make sure you check out criticalthinkingisrequired.com. You can see the other parts of this literature series. I'm going to have 2 more parts. I said it was going to be 5, but it's going to be 2 more parts, 5 and 6, and that'll be tomorrow and then the next day. So they're going to be coming out real soon, and we will be all done with For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard, where you don't even have to read it. You could simply, well, you could, but you could simply go through all our PowerPoint presentations and just get all the information there. It's all summed up. It's a summarization, some in my own word, most of it in my own words, or in his words, or you can read it, or you can listen to it. You can listen to it through the podcast. But thank you for listening, and as always, think critically.